Welcome to Revenue Harvest, a podcast about the fundamentals of sales leadership. Did you know most sales teams don't hit their sales targets? And you can't afford to miss yours. This podcast will give you the answer to questions that will help you lead your team better, consistently exceed your sales targets, and make the most of your career. I'm your host, Nigel Green, and the whole idea behind these conversations is to learn from people who can make you a better sales leader. Let's get started. Andy, how you doing?
Good to meet you, Nigel.
Yeah, it's nice to meet you. So Tom Critchlow, if you're listening, thank you. A couple of weeks ago, Tom pinged me and said, have you read this strategic narrative stuff from Andy Raskin? And I said, no. And I immediately jumped into Medium and started doing some research and was quite amazed by the work that you've done on this concept of the strategic narrative, right?
Thank you.
And you say that the strategic narrative and the sales narrative really should be the same thing, but for many companies, they're not.
Yeah, I think there is this concept of, what's the story we're going to tell to the world that every leader, entrepreneur, sales team, has to think about. And the tradition. So the first question is like, where are we going to write this thing down? Like, in what form are we going to craft it and align it and see if it works? And the traditional answer to this question is we're going to put it in a place that the world doesn't see. So we're going to put it in some kind of like positioning template or some kind of internal, story presentation. And in my experience, like that approach would break down because, well, for a few reasons. One, the whole ideas of those is that it's a kind of like DNA asset. People are going to go back to it all the time to like, I'm going to go back and look at that thing. If I need to, do a sales pitch, I'll go look at this thing. What are the things I should be saying? And then I'll say those things. And I think people forget to go back, after a while. Like usually it's held in, marketing or some executive has it, and it kind of gets forgotten about. The other thing is those things are usually not in the form that like someone can really go and talk to someone. Usually they're, here's all our target personas and here's the problem they have and here's like the message for them. And I think it's hard to just take these like snippets of messages and construct a real pitch to somebody. So when I started doing this work, I really thought hard, like what is the asset that we should use to define the story that everyone's telling? And I came to the sales deck, that the sales deck is really the sales pitch is really the core narrative of the company. It's the core narrative not only for selling, but it's the core narrative for recruiting. Why do I want to join this company? What are they doing? Why? It's the core narrative, of course, for investors. I mean, who are the investors gonna first call when they're doing due diligence? They're gonna call customers and ask, like, why are you buying this thing? So they want to know that too. So yes, I see the sales narrative as is the strategic narrative. And is the primary story that we're all telling.
So there are probably people listening here, sales leaders listening here, executives listening, and they're pointing the fingers at each other. So I can think of some CEOs that are saying, well, it's the sales leader's responsibility to work with marketing and come up with a sales narrative. And I've worked with sales leaders that say, good luck getting my CEO to come on a sales call or participate in any of this voice stuff. We've got a 1, 3, and 5 year plan that he built in the office with the private equity group that no one's seen, and we've got all this aspirational mission vision language that could be the Dunder Mifflin mission statement. So how do you bridge that gap?
Yeah, so I don't even try. So my feeling about this is CEO work. So this strategic narrative, I don't just call it strategic because to make it sound better. I really believe like this is the strategy. Like this narrative is the articulation of strategy. Yes, fine to have these goals like you're talking about, and what's our goal for the year and our goal for 5 years? Great, but that's not going to really tell people on a day-to-day basis, like, how do I have to make this decision in the moment. Like, what do I do? I think that is really CEO work. And yeah, there's probably a minority of CEOs who see it this way. And I've been lucky enough that there are enough that this has been a way for me to make a living. But yeah, I'll often, when I first started doing this work, I'd hear from like marketing VP or sales leader say, hey, really love your stuff that you're writing about strategic narrative. I want to hire you to do it for our company. Our CEO will, he'll be involved, or, she'll be looking at it, but, I'll be leading it. And at the beginning, I would accept those projects. And after a while, I looked and like, which were the projects that were really good? Like the result was really good, where I saw the story like just powering everything they were doing. It was always where the CEO was really leading it. And so eventually I just stopped accepting the work unless it was the CEO who was reaching out to me and saying they wanted to do this. I mean, the marketing leader, sales leader, they play a big role in my projects as well. But the CEO is the one who's like in the trenches with me, building it, shaping it. And then the rest of the team is kind of helping to kind of guide that CEO.
So in the world of like corporate messaging and storytelling, you and I, before we hit record, talked about my experience at StoryBrand, and we talked about some other individuals that are in this storytelling space. And, a lot of it seems to be, originated or some kind of spinoff of Joseph Campbell's work of the hero's journey and that type of arc. And what's interesting, and I tend to be pulled to about your work, is it has really nothing to do with the customer. It has everything to do with where the market's going and the reality that in every big strategic decision or every big shift in the market, there are winners and losers. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, well, you raised a couple of different points. All this stuff goes back to Campbell, but first of all, I found that when I talked about Campbell and stuff like that, I don't know, it just felt kind of geeky to me, and I didn't feel like it really resonated. The other thing is, I actually don't see what I do as part of this is like epic storytelling. A pitch is not a 3-act screenplay. We are not talking about the journey of a character, a specific character over time in any literal way, right? I would argue, I would push back and say the strategic narrative that I talk about is I do think it's about the customer, but it's not specifically about the customer. So what I mean by that is I really think about it less about than epic storytelling, more like kind of journalism. So, if you look at the great strategic narratives, they all have this structure, which is, there was an old game that used to be a great game that was the way to win in the world. And now there's a new game. And look, all the winners are starting to play this new game. The classic one that I wrote about, and well, the real classic one was Marc Benioff in 2000, telling the world software is over. And there's this new game called the cloud. That story, I mean, it is about the customer in a very real sense, but it's really presenting to the customer what I would call news. It's saying, hey, in a very boiled down, simple model, hey, the old game is over. There's a new game that the winners are playing. When I see this stuff about like epic storytelling, like make your customer the hero, what that feels to me is very much like it's basically like your customer has a problem, you have the solution. it's that old, it's the same, problem solution framework, just kind of put in terms of movies. And what I think is, and that's fine. Like, maybe if that's working for you, like, do it. What I see the great CEOs who are building, what people call categories, or, I think is maybe better described as like movements and, real brand differentiation. They're really pitching this news about this shift in the world. And that's, when that resonates with CEOs, that's when they'll call me, and, and it'll be a fertile territory for us to engage.
So what's really interesting about that is, without exception, when I talk to a CEO or I talk to an investment firm about an asset, the word disruption, disintermediate, redefine, those all seem to be characteristics or aspirational adjectives of the company. Yet, if you subscribe to the heroic journey model, it doesn't seem to create any space for reinventing the game.
Yeah, it's very much focused on this one, usually like persona, or customer type. And what I like about the old game, new game framework is, or what I call strategic narrative, is it really is going to change the game for everybody. And one of the things that I like to have CEOs do is say, okay, there's this old game, new game shift. And now can we, first of all, not just, hey, we're disrupting healthcare, but literally what is the old and new? There's a lot of talk about, like healthcare used to be a volume game. Now it's a value game. There's a lot of these shifts that people are starting to talk about. And I think you'll see healthcare companies start to sort of latch on to these shifts in ways that make sense for them. But when we are talking about a shift, we can apply that to many different personas, because usually we're talking to many different audiences, whether that's different industries, different roles. And this I found is a better framework for doing that.
So the healthcare example is obviously very relevant for me. My question is, so say I'm a CEO and you've got my attention. I'm all ears, Andy. I want to be a part of this in-game, new game. Where do I begin the journey? If I had you, where would we start? And like, are there clear stages or phases to move from the heroic to the strategic narrative? And how do I shift my mindset?
I don't even start with a heroic, that structure. I asked the CEO to create what I call strategic narrative team, which is the CEO and a small leadership group. Usually these are the heads of sales, marketing, product. Sometimes there's like a COO type person or a co-founder. Basically, I'm asking them to get together people who know the inputs to the story, who almost like a market proxy. They know the customer story, and the people who are just super important to champion this narrative, to smell their scent on it going forward. And I take the teams through a process, usually lasts about 6 to 8 weeks, where the CEO and I are building the narrative based on the input from the team. I also have the team ask customers a bunch of questions, and these questions, the interviews we do with customers, not so much like, what do you love about our company? What don't you love about our company? It's more, what is changing in your world such that what we're delivering to you is so much more valuable now than it would have been, I don't know, some short time ago? And get them talking about the shift. And sometimes they'll literally give us the words that we use for this old game, new game, shift. Language. In every case I found, they'll give some validation to one direction of maybe several we might be thinking about when we looked at, a bunch of different customers taken together, what we're hearing from them. And then it's a matter of I refine it back and forth between the CEO and the team. I'm working with the CEO one-on-one, the team's kind of weighing in. And then, though, the real test of it, though, is getting it out of the echo chamber of the team and then starting to use it in real situations. And by that, I really mean sales. So I think one of the big blocks for, the CEO telling a story or marketing, putting some new story in the company is sales. Like, is sales going to take it? And so I really just go the opposite way. Let's do this first in sales, see if it works. So we're not like rolling it out to the whole sales team, but maybe the CEO or the head of sales or one or two sales reps are trying it, and is it working? And how can we make it better? We usually learn a lot from these initial sales calls. And one CEO I was asking her, like, how did you know it was working? And she said, I knew it was working when I felt like a therapist. Like I would say this, hey, there's an old game and there's a new game, and look at the winners. And they would say, yes, let me tell you how this is playing out in my company. And, salespeople talk about discovery. And one way to do discovery is to, ask the questions. What are your pains? What are your problems? This is a different approach. Well, it can be, in complement with that. I find that it often will get even deeper stuff because we're not specifically asking them. We're just kind of empathizing with them. They're saying, yes, you're telling my story, and let me, and I trust you because of that. And so I'm going to tell you now what's really going on. And isn't this what we want?
You said you do a lot of diligence around inputs 6 to 8 weeks. How does a team know when it's ready to take it out of the echo chamber and begin testing it?
Usually there's a point when I ask the CEO, I say, hey, are we ready? Are we ready to take this out into the world? And usually it's clear. And we get to that point, and that's when we start doing it. And usually it's after a few weeks.
How does you said it wasn't the whole sales team, but you self-selected a couple of groups or individuals. How do they typically respond when they first see and hear this?
Well, sometimes it's literally the CEO doing the calls, him or herself. Sometimes it's the sales leader. So they've kind of like drank my Kool-Aid in our working sessions together. But yeah, sometimes they'll have one of their more junior people come and start doing the sales calls. And I usually do a training with that person because the structure of this is totally different from the structure of a typical deck. Like the structure of a typical deck is, let me tell you, you probably want to know about how great we are. So let me tell you about all our logos. Let me tell you about all investors. Let me tell you about whatever, a bunch of great stuff about us. So so the idea is like build credibility. And then I'm going to tell you what your problem is. Here's your problem. And then I'm going to tell you what our solution is. And I might tell you also like why it's better than all the other solutions. And so this is a very different approach. It's, hey, here's the change in the world. As you said, then look, all the winners, they're all on board with this, playing this new game, this new approach to the world. And the old, here's why the old game is a road to ruin. And, by this point, we should be having people tell us, shaking their heads. Yeah. And even opening up about what's happening. And so I'll usually do a session with, if it's a more junior person who hasn't been part of that work, a session with them and the CEO and sometimes the sales leader to have those people present to that person and explain how they want to use that deck in this way.
So there are some really credible companies that have worked with you, and a couple that are household names. A lot of them are. What are the implications? I mean, you talk about in some of your work that the notion of getting this strategic narrative right can fundamentally change the valuation of a company.
Yeah, I mean, what is the valuation of the company aside from that? I mean, it's of course there's numbers that come out, but your expectations of growth, which is really the fundamental factor in evaluation, that's all story. And I think a lot of early stage founders tell me that this approach has been really helpful with them with VCs. And if you think about it, what are VCs looking for? They're looking for, as you said, like disruptive companies. And when you present to them like, hey, here's our great stuff, here's our great idea, what's one of the first things they're going to think about? They're going to think, well, why isn't anyone else doing this? And they're going to have this doubt. And if you start with this shift in the world, then you're kind of giving them the answer to that. You're saying, hey, the world was like this, but now it's becoming like this. You're helping them like smell the opportunity the way that you did when you first are starting the company. So yeah, I mean the companies, some companies that I write about or some I've worked with that have done this really well. So in the sales area, Gong. So this company, they've done a lot of incredible work on what they would call category creation, this thing around revenue intelligence. And the CEO will say, like, a lot of this was inspired by some work we did where it was, we talked about, like, what is this shift? And the way that he defined it is goodbye opinions, hello reality. So there was an old world where the sales organizations were run on opinions, and that was a great game. That worked great for a long time, but now we're going to move to this other world where it's going to be based on a reality view. And that company, they have competitors who are doing kind of similar stuff, but their valuation is many X the competitors. And I don't know if that's only the way they've been telling the story, but so I have a podcast of my own. I actually interviewed Marc Benioff about that work and about the role it plays in the company. And I think he would say that it's a huge part of that valuation. He also told me that opinions to reality thing is like the filter that everybody uses at the company for everything, like even for product decisions. Like, is it about opinions? Because they get a lot of requests from sales teams to do different features. And he was like, well, is it opinions or is it getting us closer to a view of reality? And that's the simple filter they can use for everything.
So let's go back to the healthcare example where you talked about this shift in the world away from fee-for-service to value-based care. And there are a lot of healthcare companies, service providers, product makers trying to participate in this shift. Some of the challenges that I'm seeing is that we seem to be, in some categories, right in the middle of the shift, where sometimes it's easier to run back to the old world than it is to make the leap to the new world. How do you see that, and how do you work around that in your work?
Yeah, I love the way you put it, like this tendency to run back. I love that, and I really that is why also I think I like this term movement as opposed to category. Right, movement. What we're really saying is, hey, there is this new, there's this new approach, this new ideology, and the winners are, and this train has left the station, and the winners are on it, or it's leaving the station. Do you want to be on it or not? And this, a lot of sales leaders and CEOs when they approach me, they say, hey, we're doing great, but I'm not feeling like the urgency in the buyer. And I think this is what it comes down to. Like, if we're just talking to them about, hey, you have a problem, we can make you a hero. This is not. There's no urgency there. I mean, unless the person is really like in the emergency room, like if their problem is so acute, and this is basically the early adopters, right? The early adopters, they don't really need a story. They see it. It's the mainstream folks where they don't see the story, and we are calling it early every time. So that as the volume to value, that's just one possible way to do it, and you could even argue that's kind of old now. Like, it's, I don't know, maybe people talking about that too much. Maybe that's not even fertile territory for a story anymore. There actually is a healthcare company I'm working with where they considered that, and they actually threw it out for that reason. It was like too big, or even like sort of everyone's talking about that, so it's not differentiating enough. But however you nail that shift, it's always going to be controversial. And it's controversial because of what you said, Nigel. There's this clinging to the status quo. And that is what the behavioral economists call the loss aversion. There is this, why jump on this train and this new ideology and play this new game if the old one is, you're sort of doing okay? This actually is a place where I do get some inspiration from movies. So, in Star Wars, when Obi-Wan comes to Luke and says, hey, let's go, Luke has been belly aching the whole time about he wants to go have adventures and all this kind of stuff. So Obi-Wan comes to him and he says, hey, okay, there's this adventure I want to take you on. Let's go. And do you remember what Luke says?
No.
He says no. He says, it's getting kind of late. Got to go home. I got some chores to do. My parents are going to be, foster parents are going to be worried. He's clinging to that status quo. And, this is what the Joseph Campbell called refusal of the call. Like he's just, why go, right? And so we need to show the stakes. And this is why we have to talk about the winners and the losers. We have to say, like, hey, the winners are doing this. And we have to say, look, isn't it clear? Like, excuse me, great example of this, one I read about a lot is this company called Zuora. Zuora does like subscription billing. They have a platform for companies doing subscription billing. And back in 2015 or even earlier, when not too many people were doing subscriptions, it was just starting kind of, they start telling this story about we're moving into a subscription economy, which is, as you said, like they're telling this early, like they're going to companies like Ford and saying, hey, everyone's going to be subscribing to your cars soon. And you can imagine the people at Ford like, what? And so Zuora showed like, hey, look at all the companies that are thriving. If in terms of like the incumbents, if they haven't shifted from selling stuff to selling services, like they're dead. Like, the IBMs of the world and the HPs. And look at all the all the new stars, like the unicorns, like Uber, Airbnb, Box, Dropbox. These companies are all natively subscription companies. So they're making this argument that like the winners are doing this. And then they're showing like, hey, and at the same time, there's this die-off of companies in the Fortune 500, and it's accelerating. And they show stats about this. And they're like, hey, look, the message is clear. Like if you're going to stay playing that old game, you're dead. And so it's the stakes that it's making it about life and death that get people to move. Why does Luke go eventually? Because the Empire kills his parents, and now he has no choice. He really and I think it's kind of implied they're coming after him, and so he's probably going to be dead. but he has this other shot with Obi-Wan, so he goes.
Sometimes I see what I would characterize as a trap in that the company is flirting with this new world, but yet they've built in a safety net of retreat. And their sales team, maybe they think of it in their mind that it's a down offer, or it's some other way in which to create an opportunity for the customer to transact with them. But it's not this burn the boat mentality. And so they end up losing in the end. Do you ever see that?
I guess I don't see that. And here's why I think it has to be led by the CEO. So if the CEO leads it and like everybody is screaming about this shift, I think that salesperson has no choice. And in fact, when I first learned about that Zuora sales pitch, the way I learned about it was I was working with a team. I was already doing this work, kind of working on messaging and stuff with leadership teams, and I was talking about this approach that I was starting to use. And the sales leader had been at Zuora, and he said, "Hey, this really sounds like what we used to do at Zuora." And he shared with me the pitch deck. And what he told me was it was the greatest situation he had ever had as a salesperson, because he said that the story about this shift from selling things to subscription, so outright ownership, people wanting to own things, to people wanting to kind of have the benefits of those things without the owning of those things. The CEO's telling this story, marketing's telling this story. The CEO's telling it on like every time he goes on TV, he would tell it on like Mad Money. And he said, for me as a salesperson, that's like air cover. And then I would just go down and knock down deals. And this is, I think, the way that it ideally works.
I'm imagining there are some folks that are going to listen to this, Andy, and say, Nigel, Andy, when I think about what I'm offering in the market, I don't know how to map it to a big shift. What do you say to them?
Yeah, and that's usually I hear that a lot, and I think there always is one. So I just have a theory that I haven't found one yet where it can't be done.
So what questions do I need to think about if I feel like that's me? Like how do I begin to tease that out?
Yeah. Well, like I said, where's the best place to get this? Talking to Andy in a room? No. Who might we best get it from? Customers. These are the people who, they bought it because they saw it as urgent. And why did they see it as urgent? Something must have been happening in their life, right? And so I actually wrote a post. It's called "Why Great Pitches Come from Customers." And it includes 5 questions that I ask or I have the teams ask their customers when I'm working with them. And the first question I like to ask is, how do we change your life? And they'll say something. This is kind of them summing it all up, right? And then the second question is the one I mentioned earlier, which is, well, what has changed in your world such that whatever you just said, that how we change your life, that's more valuable to you now than than if we could have done that some short time ago. How has the world changed? And that's where we usually will start to hear the answer to that to the question.
Let's talk about this for a second. You talked about the Zuora example. For those that are curious, you can actually get a copy of this deck, the best sales deck ever. You can go to Zuora, and I think they've got it gated now. If you give them their email address, you can download the PDF. They're all over it. So
yeah, so that post is like 5 years old now, and they put that up almost immediately, and they told me, it was like a blessing and a curse, because it got them like hundreds of thousands of leads. At the same time, a lot of those are just people who are looking to build a great deck and not interested in their subscription software. But yes, I made it clear actually in my post that I reconstructed their pitch. I didn't share the actual pitch that salesperson gave me because I didn't want to do that. I reconstructed it from some of their public slides. Again, like they're telling the same story everywhere. And so what they put up there is like basically my reconstructed thing. And that, but you can learn pretty much the same thing from that you could learn from the actual one that I built it from. So yeah, I think it's very, very educational.
There's something that stands out about this deck that is really different from a lot of other decks too. Not only is it that it talks about a big shift, the winners and losers, and then cites, like you said, journalism. It just cites empirical evidence of this shift. But again, I think even if you do that, there's this trap for it to read like a newspaper and be so text heavy, and you lose me. And if you look at this deck, I mean, there's no more than 10 words on a slide. How do you pull that off? That's another big move you've got to make as a company.
There's so many things to say here. First of all, I think every slide. So now we're getting into slide craft versus kind of like, I guess, narrative. But I think everybody who's probably Nancy Duarte would say this or whoever, be very clear what the idea is you want to express on that slide, right? And the title of the slide should be that takeaway. So one thing I see a lot is we'll say see a slide, it'll say what customers are saying will be the title. And then there'll be 5 quotes. And so you're asking the person to do a lot of work. You're asking a viewer to do a lot of work to figure out the takeaway of that slide. Never make them do any work. So always pull out the takeaway. So this would be I don't know, customers say they love us because X. I don't know. It's an example. Another example is in investor decks. Sometimes they'll be just labeled the team. And then it's up to you to do a lot of work, the investor to do a lot of work, well, who are these people? And, what should I take away about them? I mean, give them something a combined 150 years in the healthcare space or something as the takeaway. Give them one takeaway, right? And then once you've done that, I mean, I think then you can start to say, well, what else really does need to be on this slide? And maybe not much, because once you have that line, well, what's the minimum amount of stuff you need to support it? Not all the Zuora slides have just 10 words. Some of them have more, but some of them are very, very sparse. And part of that too is getting used to not feeling like you have to dwell on slides for a long time. Some slides you could present them and move on in 3 seconds, and that's fine. You're presenting the idea, and then you're probably in the next slides going to explain that idea rather than sort of sitting on each slide. But yes, that slide deck, I'm not a designer. I don't design decks, and that's not my area of expertise. But I think a lot of people did take inspiration from that one because it is so sparse. It's just got these full bleed images and very little text, like you said.
Let's talk about as we're kind of wrapping this up. This is a question that I've been really wanting to ask you, and with each passing day, that we're recording this at the end of May in 2021, the world is moving back into a more whatever it's going to be, right? And I wonder, I see in my work, and I wonder if it's true in other people's work, there's this nostalgia and almost this longing that what what the business experience from a result and a sentiment perspective is immediately going to just return back to the way it was for a lot of companies. And I try to challenge them that when you have black swan events like that, sentiment in the market and the customer fundamentally shifts. And I wonder, the question is, and I know I'm taking a while to set it up, has there ever been in our recent history a more appropriate time to use sentiment to reshape strategic narrative?
Well, what do you mean by sentiment here?
Well, so let's say, so for like a real example in my work, I have sales leaders that say, well, now that we're getting vaccines and the world's opening up, and our reps feel safe traveling, we're going to get back out on the road. And I challenge them to say, but your customer doesn't even have an office anymore. They surrendered the lease. How's that going to work? Or maybe they don't want you there anymore because a decision maker is working from home and has it in his contract that he doesn't have to go to the office anymore. Yeah. And so I wonder how much of that, and even if you take the Zor example of like this move to a subscription base, I mean, when you look at the big companies that do subscription based models and how everything just exploded with delivery now. I mean, that's not going away. Like it's not going to go back just because people have vaccinated. It's a huge shift in sentiment. So how do you account for that? And does it mean that maybe everyone ought to rethink strategic narrative?
Well, COVID, which is the event, that we're talking about, hopefully things will, hopefully COVID itself will not be an issue at some time in the short future, and we seem to be on the road to that. At least in the United States, and in other countries, it's persisting and still a very big issue. But hopefully around the world, it will not be an issue in the way it has been. And so I think we don't want to necessarily build the strategic narrative around COVID, like to say like the world has shifted because of COVID. Like there was a pre-COVID and now there's COVID. Like that story I think will be old fast. Hopefully will be old fast. But what we're seeing when I work with teams, because this is obviously with every industry, I work with teams in so many different industries, and COVID is this huge, as you said, sort of event in all of them. What I find in most of them is COVID is was an accelerant. It was a catalyst of a shift that was already happening, that you could already see happening, and COVID only accelerated it. And this is the way that Gong talks about it this way. Like, opinions to reality was a shift they were talking about before COVID, but and part of this is because, hey, now you have these sales calls recorded. You have them as data that you can mine with artificial intelligence or whatever. And COVID has just accelerated that because obviously now all the sales interactions are recorded, or a much larger share of them, or can be recorded. And so the way I like to think about this is, there are always shifts happening that we can build the narrative around. And an event like COVID is a catalyst for whatever that shift is. But it's not, unless we're literally working like in the COVID vaccine space or something. It's not usually.
It's not the shift
around. Yeah.
One question I don't ask this of every guest, but certainly you're someone that I really love the way you think. So I want to know, what do you read?
My favorite book that's related to this stuff, I've already actually borrowed concepts from it in our conversation here without crediting him, so I would like to do it, is Chris Voss's Never Split the Difference. He talks about this idea of gaining trust through essentially summarizing the captor's story back to them and getting a "that's right." And isn't that what we're talking about with the strategic narrative? We're saying, hey, there's this shift in the world, it's creating stakes, and we're looking for them to say, yeah, that's right, and we're looking to gain trust this way, and then to have them kind of open up to us. That book is just hugely influential to me, as selling in my own for my own practice, and also in the way that I think about the role of strategic narrative and what CEOs are really doing when they're using it.
Yeah, I love that book, particularly in sales teams of handling objections from a customer, particularly around pricing, concessions, and delays. Chris talks about putting the work back on the terrorist to say, how am I supposed to do that?
Right.
Yeah, so that's one of I love Chris for that. So, anything else that you're reading now that relevant to this or not?
Well, yeah, I'll tell you about a book that I'm reading. This book is called Soul Without Shame. It's not really related to this, but it's all about the voice in your head and how to start. This we all have this voice in our head, and a lot of us it attacks us. Like we use it to attack ourselves. Like when we have like imposter syndrome or, whatever, it just kind of shows up in lots of different ways. And this is a book about kind of listening, starting to like transcribe it. Like, what's it saying? What is it literally like? Whose voice is it? Was it, one of your parents' voices when you were growing up? Or was it, someone else, that you kind of incorporated for safety when you were a kid, but then it's sort of like, you don't really need it anymore. And to kind of like play with it. And I found, when I start these projects with CEOs, all the questions you've said, like, what is the shift? Like, I don't know what the shift, or they'll be like, hey, Andy, we've been working on this for 2 years, like what we're going to say to the market. And, we haven't been able to figure it out. I'm like, oh my God, how am I going to do this? They've been, they've been working on this for a couple of years. And so, I can get really I can put the pressure on myself a lot and get really scared about it. And I found this book to be just really helpful with dealing with pressure and lightening it up for myself.
Well, Andy, thanks for joining me today. If someone's listening to this and wants to find you, where would you point them? How do we find Andy?
One best place is LinkedIn. So LinkedIn, just look me up, Andy Raskin. I am usually posting about stuff. Often I'm posting about, anonymously, but about things I've learned with teams I'm working with. And then my website is andyraskin.com.
All right, Andy, thank you so much.
Yeah, great talking with you, Nigel.
Music from this episode is from my good buddy Justin Adams. You can listen to Justin's music at Spotify or Apple Music. Thank you, Justin, for the music, and thank you for checking out another episode of The Revenue Harvest.